Keith's challenge was simple. Open G tuning, fast tempo. But Jimi Hendrix stopped before touching the guitar, looked at Keith, and what he did next was something nobody expected. London. March 1967. A basement rehearsal room off Wardour Street in Soho, late afternoon light filtering through a single street-level window, casting long shadows across bare wooden floors. The room smelled of cigarette smoke, old amplifiers, and the particular mustiness of spaces where music happens in private. There were maybe 8 people in the room. Keith Richards, Jimi Hendrix, a couple of session musicians whose names time would forget, someone's girlfriend sitting cross-legged in the corner. The air was thick with the casual arrogance that comes when young men who are very good at something gather in small spaces. Keith was holding a Telecaster. Vintage Sunburst. The guitar that had carried the Rolling Stones through 3 albums and a dozen countries. He'd been playing for the last 20 minutes, demonstrating his signature open G tuning, the 5-string approach that would define his sound for the next 50 years. Jimmy sat on a wooden stool against the wall. Quiet. Watching. His own Stratocaster resting against the amplifier behind him, untouched. He'd been in London for 4 months. The Jimi Hendrix Experience had released their first single 2 weeks ago. Some people knew his name. Most didn't yet. Keith finished a riff. A descending blues line that rolled and bent in that particular way open G allows. He looked up at Jimmy, and there was something in the look. Not hostility exactly, but challenge. The kind of challenge that happens when one guitar player wants to see what another can do. "You ever work in open G?" Keith asked, casual, but everyone in the room heard the subtext. Jimmy didn't move. "Sometimes. It's the only tuning that matters for rock and roll," Keith continued, warming to his subject, that English public school confidence carrying his voice across the small room. "Everything else is just jazz complexity. Open G is primal. Direct. You can't hide behind technique. It's all feel." One of the session musicians nodded. Someone lit a cigarette. The girlfriend in the corner looked up from her magazine. Jimmy still hadn't moved. "That's one way to see it." Keith smiled. Not unkindly, but with the particular smile of someone who believes they've just scored a point. He stood up and walked across the room, extending the Telecaster toward Jimmy. "Go on then. Show us what you do with it. Open G, fast tempo. Let's hear your version." The room went quiet. Not dramatically. Just the natural settling of attention when something is about to happen. Jimmy looked at the guitar in Keith's hands. Then he looked at Keith. And then he did something no one expected. He didn't take the guitar. Hendrix didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. "Why fast?" Jimmy asked quietly. His voice was soft, almost diffident, the kind of tone that makes people lean in to hear. Keith blinked. "What? Why does it need to be fast?" Keith lowered the guitar slightly. "Well, I mean, that's where the excitement is. The energy. Fast is where you prove what you can do." Jimmy nodded slowly, as if considering this. "Who are you proving it to?" The question hung in the air. Simple. Not aggressive. Just curious. But the room felt it, the subtle shift, like a change in air pressure before weather turns. Keith tried to laugh it off. "To everyone, mate. To the audience. To other players. That's the game, isn't it?" "Is it?" Jimmy stood up now, not quickly, just unfolding his long frame from the stool. He walked to where his Stratocaster leaned against the amplifier. Everyone assumed he was finally going to play, to answer Keith's challenge. But instead, he just stood there, one hand resting lightly on the guitar's neck, not picking it up. "I was at your show last week," Jimmy said. "Seville Theatre. You played the last time. Middle section. You slowed it way down. Made everyone wait. That was the moment that mattered. Not the fast parts. The slow part. The part where you made space." Keith's expression changed. The confident smile faded, replaced by something more complicated. Recognition, maybe? Or the beginning of it. That's different, Keith said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. That's arrangement. I'm talking about technique. About what you can actually do with your hands. Jimmy picked up his guitar now. Slowly. He sat back down on the stool, the Stratocaster across his lap. He didn't plug it in. Didn't tune it. Just held it. You want to hear fast? Jimmy asked. Yeah. In open G? If you can. Jimmy's fingers moved across the fretboard. Not playing. Just touching. Mapping. Finding the geography of the retuned strings in silence. Everyone watched. The room was completely quiet. No one was smoking anymore. The girlfriend had put down her magazine. And then Jimmy spoke again, still not playing. Before I do that, can I ask you something? Keith nodded, wary now, sensing that something was happening but not quite understanding what. Why do you play in open G? Keith frowned. I told you. It's direct. Primal. It cuts through the bullshit. But why do you play it? Not why is it good. Why did you choose it? Keith opened his mouth to answer, then closed it. He looked at the Telecaster in his hands like he was seeing it for the first time. It makes certain things easier. Chords you can't quite reach in standard tuning. It opens up. It hides things too. Jimmy said gently. Doesn't it? The room contracted. That's the only way to describe it. 8 people in a basement suddenly felt like 2. What do you mean? Keith's voice was quieter now. Standard tuning has 6 strings. You play 5. Open G lets you drop that low E and still have power. It's not about what it gives you. It's about what you don't have to deal with. In that quiet moment, Hendrix did something no one expected. Jimmy began tuning the Stratocaster. Not to open G. To standard tuning. Everyone could hear it, the small adjustments, the harmonic checks, the patient work of bringing 6 strings into alignment. He did it slowly, methodically, like a man who had done this 10,000 times and would do it 10,000 more. Keith stood there, still holding his Telecaster, watching. When Jimmy finished tuning, he looked up. You asked me to play fast in open G. I could do that. But I don't think that's what you really want to hear. What do I want to hear then? Keith asked, and there was no challenge in his voice now. Just genuine curiosity. I think you want to hear what you're afraid of. The session musicians exchanged glances. The girlfriend in the corner had stopped breathing. Keith's jaw tightened. I'm not afraid of anything. Everyone's afraid of something, Jimmy said simply. Usually it's the thing they've built everything to avoid. He positioned his fingers on the fretboard. Still unplugged. Still silent. But everyone in the room could somehow hear what was about to come. You dropped that 6th string because it complicated things. Because it made you have to think about voicings you didn't want to think about. Because standard tuning has too many options and open G gives you boundaries. Boundaries feel like freedom when what you're really afraid of is choice. Keith's face had gone very still. I'm not saying it's wrong. Jimmy interrupted gently. Boundaries are good. They make you creative in different ways. But you asked me to play in your tuning, in your tempo, in your framework. You asked me to prove something in a game you designed. And I'm asking you, why? Silence. Keith looked at his guitar. At his hands. At the floor. When he looked back up at Jimmy, something in his face had changed. The armor had cracked. Because, Keith said slowly, because if you can do everything I can do in my system, plus everything you do in yours, then what's the point of my system? Subscribe and leave a comment, because the meaning of this moment is still unfolding. Jimmy nodded. Not triumphantly. Just acknowledging. That's the fear. That someone else's freedom makes your choice look small. He stood up, walking across the small space to where Keith stood. He held out his hand, not for the Telecaster, but for Keith's right hand. Keith, confused, extended it. Jimmy held it for a moment, turning it over, looking at the calluses, the years of work written in skin and scar tissue. Your hands did things I'll never do, Jimmy said quietly. You and Chuck Berry and Muddy Waters. You took American blues and made it British and made it yours. You found a voice in 5 strings that most people can't find in 6. That's not small. That's everything. He let go of Keith's hand, stepped back, picked up his own Stratocaster again. So I'm not going to play an open G. Not to prove I can. Not to beat you in your own game. Because that's not why we do this. Then why do we do this? Keith asked, and the question was genuine. Jimmy plugged in his guitar. The amplifier hummed to life. He adjusted the volume, low, conversational. We do it to show each other what we hear. Not to prove who hears better. Just to share the hearing. And then he played. Not fast. Slow. Achingly slow. A blues in E, standard tuning. 6 strings. But the way he voiced the chords. The way his thumb wrapped over the top of the neck to catch that bass note. The way his other fingers found harmonics and bent strings into conversation with each other. It was like listening to someone speak a language Keith had thought he knew but was suddenly hearing with new grammar. It wasn't technical. It wasn't fast. It wasn't showing off. It was just complete. Jimmy played for maybe 90 seconds. Then stopped. The final note hung in the air, vibrating in the wood of the walls, the bodies of the other guitars in the room, the bones of the 8 people listening. No one spoke. Keith looked at his Telecaster. He looked at the 5 strings. The open G tuning he'd been so proud of moments ago. And then he did something that everyone in that room would remember for the rest of their lives. He sat down on the floor. Just sat down, crossing his legs, laying the guitar across his lap. And he started crying. Not sobbing. Just silent tears running down his face. I thought, Keith said, his voice rough. I thought I knew what I was doing. Jimmy sat down next to him. Not touching. Just sitting. You do know. You know exactly what you're doing. But knowing isn't the same as understanding. And understanding isn't the same as accepting that there's more to know. I spent 3 years perfecting this tuning. I know. I wrote songs people will remember. I know. And you just played 6 strings like they were easy. Jimmy smiled slightly. They're not easy. They're just different. And your 5 strings aren't easy either. Different difficulties. Different rewards. Keith wiped his face with the back of his hand. Laughed shakily. Christ. You didn't even play fast. You asked me to. But that's not what you needed to hear. What did I need to hear? That your choice is valid. That open G is real. That you don't have to apologize for the string you dropped. But also, that dropping it was a choice. Not the only choice. Your choice. And that's what makes it yours. What followed stayed with everyone in the room, long after the last note faded. Keith Richards and Jimi Hendrix sat on that floor for another 20 minutes. Talking. Not about technique. Not about guitars. About fear. About choosing limitations. About the difference between mastery and dominance. About how every player is trying to solve a different problem and sometimes the problem you choose is more important than the solution you find. The other musicians eventually left. Someone had to go to a session. Someone else had a girl waiting. The room emptied until it was just Keith and Jimmy and the girlfriend in the corner, who would later tell this story to her own daughter, who would tell it to a music journalist in 1994, who would publish it in a book that almost no one read. Before Jimmy left, Keith stopped him at the door. The challenge, Keith said. I'm sorry. That was ego. Don't apologize for ego, Jimmy replied. Ego is how we know we're worth hearing. Just don't let it convince you that you're the only one worth hearing. Keith nodded. Then, will you teach me? Some of what you do? Jimmy considered this. No. But I'll play with you. And you can take what you hear. They never did a formal session together. Schedules, tours, life got in the way. But 3 months later, Keith Richards added the sixth string back to his guitar. Just for one song. A ballad. Something slow. He never told anyone why. Jimi died 3 years later. Keith kept playing in open G. But he never called it the only tuning that matters. Again. The girlfriend in the corner kept a diary. Years later she wrote, "I watched a man challenge a god and the god didn't fight back. He just showed him that gods get afraid too." Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. The Telecaster Keith held that day still exists. It's in a museum now. Someone asked Keith once if he remembered that afternoon in Wardour Street. He said yes. They asked what he learned. "That mastery isn't about what you can do," Keith replied. "It's about knowing why you do it. And being brave enough to let someone else do it differently." The basement rehearsal room is gone. Torn down in 1983. But sometimes session musicians in London still tell a story about the day Keith Richards cried on the floor and Jimi Hendrix sat down next to him without saying a word. Not because Jimi was cruel, but because silence was the kindest thing he could offer. Some lessons can only be learned in quiet.